Hello everyone. So we're on the last section of social psychology, and this time we're going to talk about social interactions. And I'm going to try my best to keep this video as short as possible, but we are going to be covering a lot. And the very first thing is a very serious thing, which is very important to talk about, especially now. But it's going to start with a question. Let's say that you are getting on a bus. And the bus is fairly packed. There's only 3 seats left. And you have to sit next to someone. So you have person A, person B, person C. You gotta sit next to one of them. Who are you gonna sit next to? And, there's already, there's people lined up behind you, so you gotta make your decision quick and figure out who you're gonna sit next to. So, again, who would you sit next to, and then why did you pick that person? And this is something that usually I would do in my class, and we would discuss it. Some of you guys just a second to quickly think. Again, it should be kind of a snap judgment, because, when you're facing a scenario like this, you don't have that much time to think. You just need to quickly decide, okay, yep, sit next to this person. Some answers I've gotten in the past are, I would sit next to this person because they kind of look like a punk, so chances are they're just gonna, listen to music with their headphones, and so they'll be quiet, they won't talk to me, and I can, just listen to music or read a book. I've heard other people say, I would sit next to the grandma because chances are she might have some snacks in her purse, or she'll tell me some really cool stories of, when she was younger, and I can strike up a conversation. I will say, historically, I have never had anyone that has picked person C. No one has ever said that they would sit next to person C because they say that he looks sleazy, he looks creepy. So usually the answers I get are either person A or person B, which is interesting. And what this is an example of is an implicit, or what it's showing is the implicit personality theory. So it's a set of assumptions about how different types of people, personality traits, and actions are related to each other. So it's these stereotypes and assumptions that form together these kind of brief ideas that we have in our head, or these schemas, which we've talked about before in this class, of essentially, how certain people are. So happy people are also very friendly. So if a person seems really happy, they're also going to be really friendly. Quiet people are shy. So, if there's a quiet person, chances are they're also very shy. It's this whole idea that we see these things growing up, whether it's personal experiences, whether it's portrayed in media or in movies, TV shows, all of that. And at a young age, we form these schemas, we form these ideas of, this is how people that look like this act like that. And so again, the examples for on the bus, people say, this person looks like, a punk rocker, so, chances are they're going to listen to music. Or, this old lady, chances are she's going to be friendly or have snacks. Like, these are all these stereotypes and assumptions that we have. Or, of course, that one person, they looked creepy, so they're going to be sleazy. And we all have these. Because, again, you have to sit next to someone on the bus. You're going to pick one. And there's a reason why you picked one over the other. We all have them. It goes way back, if we look at the evolutionary psychology point of it, to when we were in different tribes. You had to very, very quickly figure out who's in your tribe, who isn't. Is this a friend or is this a foe? Who should I be hanging out with? Who should I not? Like, it makes sense for us to make, those snap judgments in a way for survival, in a sense. But it's a slippery slope, and this is where it gets important. Because right now what this is just some stereotypes and assumptions about certain characteristics. So, if you see a happy person, a quiet person, someone that has spiked hair, someone who's older. But very soon, or very quickly, that can turn into a prejudice. where instead of it just being, this one person looks this one way, it's instead looking at a particular group. So everyone that looks this way. And it's attributing it to a negative thought. So everyone that looks like this acts like this, and that action's bad. That's a prejudice. One step further is then discrimination. And this is when you are now acting upon that prejudice. So you have decided that there is this negative feeling that you have, or this negative attribute to this group of people, and now you're going to treat that group in a bad way because of these thoughts that you have about them. And that is wrong, in any way, shape, or form. And it's surprising how quickly this can happen. Because again, as I've mentioned, we all have those stereotypes and assumptions. That we are in situations where you have to pick, who you're going to sit next to on the bus. Who you're going to, let's say that you're in class and multiple people have asked for a pencil. You only have one pencil, or you have two pencils, obviously one for you, and you have to quickly decide who you're going to lend the pencil to. Like, no matter what, we are faced with instances where we have to make snap assumptions. And it's a slippery slope. Another thing that I always say in class, and it's controversial, the prejudice, while not a good thing, is not the biggest issue. Everyone has prejudices. Just like everyone makes assumptions, everyone makes assumptions about entire groups. Again, like everyone that looks a certain way, whether they look like a punk rocker, whether they look like they're elderly. And if you have any sort of negative thoughts towards that group, that's a prejudice. What's important is being aware of those prejudices, because I don't care who you are, we all have them in some way, shape, or form, and then making sure that those prejudices never turn into discrimination. You should never be treating an entire group of individuals in a negative way based off of an assumption. If you don't know that person, if you don't know, who they are, you have no right to treat them in a negative way. And again, I won't go into a huge tangent, but it's a slippery slope. And an important thing just to think about is when we talk about prejudices, when we talk about those assumptions, is it a matter of nature or is it a matter of nurture? And the answer to that is that it's nurture. It's learned. Like, we talked about this in the previous part of social psychology when we talked about attitudes, and we just talked about it when we talked about those assumptions that we have. It's based upon experiences that we have early on in life. It's based upon the environment and how we're raised. No one is born with a prejudice. It's just not a thing. If you ever want to see examples of this, watch young children interact, during recess or on a playground. There's so many instances of little children of different color that dress up the same and say, hey, look, we're twins. And they don't realize that they're a different race. They haven't been taught yet that they're a different race and that they are different. It's something that's taught. And so to be aware of that and to know of those prejudices that we all have and to really look at them and to make sure that they never affect our actions. And I will just do one because there's other things in this chapter. Social psychology is so cool. Going back to what we talked about in a previous part of social psychology with conformity, discrimination is never okay. And sometimes things can happen where everyone is hating on a certain group. And sometimes in a way, because of things that members of that group have done, it feels like it is justified. But as I've mentioned, if you don't know that person and truly know that person's personality and character, it's not okay to discriminate. And even, with that being said, you can't know every single person of a group, ever. You're never going to interact with every single person of that group. So we can't make these giant claims. And again, even if it seems like certain groups you disagree with, it's still not okay. And one thing that I always remind people of, and it's something to always be aware of, is that no matter what, no matter how different someone is, whether it's how they look, the views they have, political stance, doesn't matter. There will always be more that you have in common with someone than differences. No matter what, you always will have more in common with someone than differences. And sometimes we forget that because we focus on the differences and we don't focus on the similarities. But at the end of the day, we're always more similar to one another than we are different. And last thing I will say before I move on, when it comes to our prejudices and these negative thoughts that we have towards certain groups, you don't have to agree with them. And just because you disagree with them does not mean that you should have negative thoughts towards them. Disagreeing is fine. The differences that we have is what makes us so wonderful and unique. And it helps us grow to communicate with people that have different views and to understand those different views. Now, there are certain views or certain actions that people do that start to harm individuals, and that's a little different. But yeah, at the end of the day, we have more in common with one another than differences. And we often overlook that. And we like to see other people and other groups as being different. But we're all human beings. Anyway, I apologize, that went on longer than I meant. We will continue. But just be aware, we all have prejudices, and they're not nice, but we need to be aware of them to ensure that they do not affect our actions. Alright, another thing is there's this whole idea of the in-group and the out-group. The in-group is who you associate yourself with, who you identify yourself with, whether it's, a certain sport, whether it's a certain group, a certain community, a certain school. There's so many things. And that's your in-group. Everybody else is then the out-group. And it's the us versus the them. And this can get very dangerous because we start to view it as us versus them instead of just seeing it as everyone. Because again, and I can't stress it enough, we always have more in common than we have differences. But that's what we mean when we talk about an in-group and an out-group. An in-group is who we identify with, out-group, who we don't. And again, when it comes to discriminating and prejudices, there's other things that we see. There's the realistic conflict theory, which essentially just says that we see an increase in prejudice and discrimination when there's conflict between the in-group and the out-group. So when you have two different groups and they don't really interact with one another, you don't see that much prejudice and discrimination. They're just two different groups of individuals. So let me see if I can quickly come up with an example. Let's say a basketball team in Florida and a bowling team in Indiana. Two different sports, don't really interact that much with one another, different states, doesn't matter. But when there's a conflict, when there's a competition, when there's a common resource that both sides are competing for or fighting for, that's when you see more prejudice. That's when you see more discrimination. And again, like a huge stress on, seeking common resources. Because in our world, there is a finite amount of resources. And a lot of times when different groups start competing for that, that's when you start to see all these prejudices emerge and grow out of control. And we start to see the other group as the enemy, and they're different, and they're not like us. But no, in fact, they're quite similar because they want the same thing that you want. That makes them more similar. So that's a realistic conflict theory. And then we also have scapegoating. And this is when, a lot of times when you see these prejudices and discrimination, it tends to be towards an outgroup that has less of an influence and less of a social power. So those that are seen as not being able to fight back as well. And you see this all the time when, things and prejudices and discrimination is done towards the homeless, towards immigrants, towards, people that can't really fight back as much. Because it's easier. They're a scapegoat. They're an easy way out. It's easy to blame them for things because they can't fight back as well. So to be aware of that as well, that when we're starting to put the blame on individuals and on groups, does that group even have a chance to defend itself? It's a thing that we should always be asking ourselves. But that's kind of things when it comes to the idea of prejudice and discrimination. Which is such an important part of social psychology, which is why I wanted to make sure to cover it in this class. I'm going to go through the rest of this kind of quickly, so I apologize. There's also prosocial behavior and antisocial behavior. We talked about this briefly when we talked about psychological disorders, because there is a common misconception of what we mean by antisocial. Antisocial does not mean that a person does not like to socialize. Antisocial means that they go against society. So prosocial is when you're acting with society. You are doing what is deemed right in your society. Antisocial means you go against it. You are not doing what society has in mind. And we see certain things when we look at this idea of prosocial and antisocial behavior. So we have altruism, which is prosocial. It's when people are sometimes risking their own safety for someone else. They're going above and beyond to help, your fellow man, your fellow woman. And sometimes to no reward. You get nothing from it, but you are doing it just to help out society, to do the right thing. And that's altruism. We also have de-individualization, where it's, especially when you're in a group or in a crowd, you lose your sense of self. So you just become this one group. And then you act as that one group. And that can get very dangerous, which we're going to be talking about very shortly. Is this going to play? Yes. This is just a very quick example. Watch this, Jogger. Push the lady. That is an example. And no one was hurt, luckily. And you'll see it again. That is an example of antisocial behavior. That is not an okay thing to do. And again, it could be that, the person didn't realize that they were pushing the lady quite as hard. But still, that goes against what society stands for. That's an example of antisocial behavior. There we go. There's also social roles. So when you're in certain positions, there's kind of this idea of how you're supposed to act and what you're supposed to do. This can get very dangerous very quickly, especially when you're put in a position of power. And this is another very controversial experiment that I wish I could go into more detail. But the Stanford prison experiment is when they took completely normal, they even took psych evaluations, they were perfectly fine, individuals, they were young men. Half the men were assigned to be prisoners, half the men were assigned to be guards, and they just wanted to see what happened. And it got ugly quickly, where the individuals that were assigned to be guards, in a sense, got drunk with power, and they started doing horrific things. No one told them to do anything. And they started doing horrific things to the other men that were assigned to be the prisoners. And it wasn't that they had done anything wrong. It was random assignment if you were a guard or a prisoner. But it showed that just because they were in this position of power, it changed their behavior. And for some of them, it turned them into monsters. And so what this experiment found is that sometimes when we're put in this position of power, it changes who we are, it changes our behavior. And we see this all the time in real life. So this was back in 2004 in Abu Ghraib in Iraq, in a prison. And the prisoners started being abused, which is not what you do. They were stripped down naked and forced to form human pyramids. They were put on blocks and they had to stand there for hours, ridiculed. That is not how human beings should be treating one another. These were regular people that, people that knew these guards were like, they're perfectly fine individuals, but the way that they started to behave was awful. Because they had this perceived, role of power. And so it's a thing that if ever you are put in a position of power to realize your behavior, to check yourself, because it gets out of control very quickly. There's so many good things for social psych. Bystander effect. This is the whole idea that the more people around you, and this goes back to what I was talking about earlier, the more people around you, the less sense of individuality and the less sense of responsibility we feel. So if you're in a giant group of people and someone calls for help, because there's so many people around you, we kind of have this idea of, someone else is going to help that person, and so you don't feel as responsible. Whereas if you are alone and you hear someone call for help, you have this sense of, oh my God, I'm the only person hearing this. If I don't do something, that person's not going to get help. You feel more responsible. And long story short, there have been unfortunate examples of when the bystander effect happens. So like the story with Kitty Genovese, who was attacked by a stalker 3 times as she was trying to get home. And on those 3 separate attacks, she was screaming for help. And 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens heard it. Some of them were, calling out from the window saying, hey, you leave her alone. But no one went to help her. And I believe it took about 30-ish minutes, if I recall correctly, for even the police to be called. Because since there were so many people around, everyone assumed that someone else, was calling the police, that someone else was going to interact. They weren't responsible for it. And unfortunately, Kitty Genovese died because of this. Even though so many people could hear her being under attack, no one went to help her because everyone thought that someone else was going to do it. So this is another huge thing to just keep in mind, that if you hear that someone needs help, so long as it does not put you in danger, check to make sure the person's okay. Sometimes people scream out because they're just playing around with their friends, and it's embarrassing when you go, thinking that they need help and they don't. But that feeling of embarrassment of interpreting it wrong is far more worth it than, potentially not interacting and a person getting seriously hurt, or really being in need of help. So be that person. Even if there's a million people around you, be that one person to just check. Because you'd be surprised how tons of people won't act on it. Because again, they always think that somebody else will. But anyway, there's lots of different examples of this, both in research and in real life, where lives have been lost. So it's a very serious thing. And again, with this whole idea of the bystander effect, it's also this idea of the diffusion of responsibility. So when there's more people around, you're not as responsible because someone else, surely will do something. And I'll very quickly talk about this study. Essentially, it was a bunch of people in a room, and the fire alarm would go off, and smoke would start being pumped into the room. This was all fake, but again, from the participants' point of view, it seemed like it was real. And there were 2 instances. One instance, it was the participant alone in the room. And again, fire alarm would go off, smoke would start coming into the room, and as you can see when they're alone, the person would very quickly report the smoke. They'd leave the room, and there's a video about this, but they would leave the room and report the smoke. It's common sense. That's what you do. But when there was a group of 3 people or more, and they would just sit, and they wouldn't do anything. Again, smoke alarm going off, smoke going into the room, but multiple people in this room do absolutely nothing. The participant, for a much longer time, would also do nothing. So much so that if it had been a real fire, everyone in that room would have died from asphyxiation. And that's dangerous. Because again, when lots of people don't respond to something, we don't want to be that one person. Again, this goes back to conformity. We don't want to be that one person that misinterprets a situation and, we get up, we think it's a fire, and then we embarrass ourselves. But because no one wants to be that person, sometimes when we need someone to say, hey, smoke alarm, no one does anything, and lives have been lost. So similar to what I said in the first part of this chapter, be that individual. Be that one person to, even at risk of embarrassing yourself, then you can be proud of the fact that you are that person that will check, that will make sure that people are okay. Because there's a lot of people that will not do that. And there is a lot of horrible things that have happened to people because there wasn't that one person to stand up. But anyway, this video has gotten too long, and I apologize. But I believe that is it for social psychology. So again, just some things, because, and again, I know some people might not be watching this at the time that it does come out, but in the time that we are in right now, it is more crucial than ever to, again, remember that we are always more similar to one another than we are different. And even if you disagree with someone or you disagree with a group, that does not make it okay to then hate on that group. Again, there are exceptions when a person is actively and purposefully hurting other people, because that's not okay. But when you disagree with someone's views, that does not make it okay for you to then have a prejudice and discriminate against that person. It is wonderful that we have different opinions. It's how we can grow as individuals to understand these different opinions and these different views and educate one another. So please remember that we have more in common than we do differences. Be aware of our prejudices to make sure that they never turn or influence our actions. And be that one person to break the mold. If you think that something is wrong, be that person to speak up. Even if it embarrasses you, even if it goes against the group, be that person. Because if you aren't that person at that crucial moment and things go horribly wrong, it's something that you will never live down and never, you regret for the rest of your life. So be that person. And I apologize that got a little dark. But that is it for social psychology, and this is actually, I believe, the last video that I will be doing for this class. And that's it.